Hi everyone, welcome to another lecture. Last time we finished PowerPoint 10 by discussing the Lincoln-Douglas debates, right? The debates that sort of set up President Lincoln to win his election in 1860. However, he ended up losing the Senate election that he was actually debating for in 1858 and sort of setting up Lincoln and Douglas for their views on slavery. And then we talked about John Brown and how he tried to lead that mass rebellion at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and ended up getting executed for treason. And he was the first one to do that. And then we began the 11th PowerPoint, which we will continue today by discussing the Civil War, sort of giving a brief overview. We also talked about why the South left, right? Because Lincoln got elected and they felt that slavery would be ended under Lincoln. And we also talked about how Lincoln did not set out to free the slaves initially, but with the circumstances of the war, it was too advantageous to not free the slaves, right? He could put the Union back together like he wanted, but also free the slaves and give the soldiers something to fight for. So today we're going to continue by getting more into, the subject in our class, which is African Americans, and discuss how they fought in the war, what they did in the war, things like that. So here's an example of some contraband, okay, which are Confederate slaves that ran away from the Confederacy to the Union camps and how they helped in those camps in exchange for their partial freedom. Okay, here's another picture of some contraband. I love getting to this point in the class because now we have more like actual photos, so we can actually see what people definitely looked like back then, right? Because sometimes art is interpretive. So as I mentioned, contraband are Confederate slaves that ran to the Union Army. If you take a look at video A, there is a reenactment of one of these camps done by volunteers, and you can see the sort of activities that they would do once they were at these camps. So at Fort Monroe in Virginia's Hampton Roads, Major General Benjamin Butler, commander, learned that 3 slaves had made their way across Hampton Roads Harbor from Confederate-occupied Norfolk County and presented themselves as Union-held Fort Monroe. General Butler refused to return the escaped slaves to slaveholders who supported the Confederacy. This amounted to classifying them as contraband. Prior to the war, the owners of the slaves would have been legally entitled to request their return as property and likely would have done so under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, as we've discussed before. General Butler took the position that if Virginia considered itself a foreign power, then he was under no obligation to return the 3 men, and he would hold them as contraband of war. So basically, they got this name because the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 no longer applies to the Confederacy, right, because they left the Union. So legally, any Union states do not have to return any slaves that escaped from the Confederacy, right? So this is pretty huge, right? This is bad for the South because if their slaves ran away, they had no ground to get them back unless they defeated the Union. So that's why you had a lot of contraband. General Butler did not pay the escaped slaves wages for work that they began to undertake, and he continued to refer to them as slaves. So you're technically not free, but you're at least not on a plantation, basically. On September 25th, 1861, the Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, issued a directive to give persons of color, commonly known as contrabands, in the employment of the Union Navy, pay at the rate of $10 per month and a full day's ration. 3 weeks later, the Union Army followed suit, paying male contrabands at Fort Monroe $8 a month and women $4. So now, at this point, you can pay these former slaves, right? They're still technically not free, but at least they're getting money, which is something that majority of them have never really earned in their life. In August, the U.S. Congress passed the Confiscation Act of 1861, which declared that any property used by the Confederate military, including slaves, could be confiscated by Union forces. So not only were contraband the people that managed to run away, but also the people that their plantations were taken over by the Union Army, right? If the Union Army won a city or a state, they could take all the slaves for themselves, right? So, while becoming a contraband did not mean full freedom, many slaves considered it a step in the right direction. Okay, so if anything you need to know about contrabands, they weren't technically free. Okay, just like when we discussed the Underground Railroad, it wasn't an actual railroad underground. Right? Okay, here's another contraband slave. Many more escaped slaves found their way to Fort Monroe and appealed to become contraband. As the number of former slaves grew too large to be housed inside the fort, the contrabands erected housing outside the crowded base from the burned ruins of the city of Hampton. They called their new settlement Grand Contraband Camp, which they nicknamed Slab Town. By the end of the war in April 1865, less than 4 years later, an estimated 10,000 escaped slaves had applied to gain contraband status, with many living nearby. Across the South, Union forces managed more than 100 contraband camps, though not all were as large. Okay. For most of the contrabands, full emancipation did not take place until the 13th Amendment, which was ratified in 1865. In 1863, after the Emancipation Proclamation and the authorization of black military units, thousands of former slaves and free blacks began to enlist in the United States colored troops, which we will get more into black soldiers in this lecture. The Army allowed their families to take refuge at contraband camps. The black troops ultimately comprised nearly 10% of all the troops in the Union Army. So that's a decent percentage of troops, right? For every 1,000 troops in the Union Army, there was 100 black troops, so pretty good number. And as you saw from the video, at the contraband camps, you could do things like cooking, cleaning, washing up the linens and uniforms. Sometimes there would be teachers there who would teach you how to read and write, which is pretty cool. You know, various things. And here is a depiction of the contraband in an old book. And here they are being lined up at one of these camps. So yeah, they pretty much hang out in these camps until the end of the war. Then when the 13th Amendment was, when the 13th Amendment was officially passed, then they could go on their way and go wherever. But until then, they pretty much were, considered property until the 14th Amendment, which we'll talk about, made all people born in the U.S. citizens. So next I want to talk about the real turning point for the war, this famous battle that I've sort of shown you a picture of and talked about briefly a couple times, but we'll get more into the details today. So as you can see, here's the battlefield. This is the Battle of Gettysburg, which if nobody knows a Civil War battle, they pretty much know the Battle of Gettysburg. So the Battle of Gettysburg was fought from July 1st to July 3rd, 1863, in and around the town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, by Union and Confederate forces during the American Civil War. The battle involved the largest number of casualties of the entire war and was often described as the war's turning point. Union Major General George Meade's Army of the Potomac defeated attacks by the Confederate General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, halting Lee's invasion of the North. Now, this is important again because Virginia is technically the Confederacy, but, it's pretty close to D.C., right, to the nation's capital. After his success at Chancellorsville in Virginia in May 1863, Lee led his army through the Shenandoah Valley to begin his second invasion of the North, the Gettysburg Campaign. With his army in high spirits, Lee intended to shift the focus of the summer campaign from war-ravaged Northern Virginia and hoped to influence Northern politicians to give up their prosecution of the war by penetrating as far as Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, or even Philadelphia. So, General Joseph Hooker, of the Union Army, moved in pursuit, but was relieved of command just 3 days before the battle and replaced by Meade, which, who knows why that happened. Elements of the two armies initially collided at Gettysburg on July 1st, as Lee urgently concentrated his forces there, his objective being to engage the Union Army and destroy it. So this was a huge battle for the South, too, because they felt that if they crushed the Union Army here, then they could take over a lot more territory and maybe even win the war. Low ridges to the northwest of town were defended initially by a Union cavalry division by General John Buford, and soon reinforced with 2 corps of Union infantry. So we have some big names in the Union Army here, right? Buford is pretty notorious. However, 2 large Confederate corps assaulted them from the northwest and north, collapsing the hastily developed Union lines, sending the defenders retreating through the streets of the town to the hills just to the south. Okay. On the second day of the battle, both of the armies had assembled. The Union line was laid out in a defensive formation resembling a fishhook. On July 2nd, Lee launched a heavy assault on the Union left flank, and fierce fighting raged at Little Round Top, the Wheat Field, Devil's Den, and the Peach Orchard. So in battlefields, you'd have different code names or names for different areas normally. So on the third day of battle, after the Union defenders held their lines on the second day, fighting resumed on Culp's Hill and cavalry battles raged to the east and south. But the main event was a dramatic infantry assault by 12,500 Confederates against the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. Right. The charge was repulsed by Union rifle and artillery fire at great loss to the Confederate army. So the Union was pretty much lined up in a great formation. They shot the Confederate soldiers who were coming towards them in mass, so they were able to successfully take down a lot of the Confederates. Lee then led his army on a retreat back to Virginia, so they left. Between 46,000 and 51,000 soldiers from both armies were casualties in this 3-day battle, which is the most deadly battle in American history. On November 19th, President Lincoln used the dedication ceremony for the Gettysburg National Cemetery to honor the fallen Union soldiers and redefine the purpose of the war in his historic Gettysburg Address. Now, the Gettysburg Address is super important because, again, not only is Lincoln honoring this battle that was really the turning point for the war, it solidified a great victory for the Union and encouraged them to win more battles after this. But he also used the opportunity to, sort of redefine the war, slip in slavery a little bit into his speech so he can say, yeah, we're fighting to free the slaves, we're fighting for morality, for the heart of the nation, stuff like that, right? So it was his chance to really redirect the war into a calling cry for people to fight, right? It's like, this is what you're fighting for, to get America back together and to free the slaves. Okay. So if you take a look at video B, there's a reenactment from a movie called Gettysburg that came out in 1993. So you can kind of see what this might look like. Many of these battles are still reenacted. I think they still reenact Gettysburg on site annually. But there's a lot of Civil War reenactors that enjoy doing it. Right? I was in a couple college classes with a guy who liked to reenact as a Confederate soldier, which, that guy was weird, but whatever. And here's an excerpt from the Gettysburg Address, where I'm not going to read the whole thing. Of course, Lincoln said, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives, and that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this, but in a larger sense we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hollow this ground. So Lincoln does a couple things here. One, he points us back to the beginning of this country, right? He's saying 7 years ago, right, that not too long ago our country was founded, right? Reminding us that we fight for the equality of all men, that we're a new country, right? And that in order to stay as a country, this is pretty significant, right? Because as a new country, the rest of the world maybe expects us to fail, or maybe it's easy for us to fail, right? Sort of reminding us like, hey, we're still the American experiment, right? Also, he talks about honoring the dead, right? Saying you shouldn't put a bunch of monuments on Gettysburg. You shouldn't, do anything to this battlefield. We should keep it as it is to remember it how it was, right? So here is Lincoln making that famous speech. Now we're going to talk about something that, is probably arguably the most important thing in Black history, right? And something that, Lincoln is forever praised for, right? And that's the Emancipation Proclamation. So here is Lincoln pictured with his advisors. Remember, we already watched that video from the movie Lincoln, right? That clip where he's arguing with them about passing the Emancipation Proclamation. So we're going to discuss why he would have to do that in order to get this passed. Because I did mention that he passed it and not Congress, which is a big deal. Okay. We'll also talk about the Emancipation Proclamation, what it actually did, because that's kind of complicated. So if you take a look at video C, there's more information on Lincoln's strategy with regards to the Emancipation Proclamation, right? Because he just didn't pass it just because he felt like it. It was a very viable military strategy. This is actually, this picture is a flyer that was posted that basically showed everybody in the towns it was posted like, hey, all the slaves are free, right? According to President Lincoln. So the Emancipation Proclamation was a presidential proclamation and executive order issued by President Abraham Lincoln on January 1st, 1863. Now, an executive order is different from a law or a bill, right? A law or a bill goes through Congress, passes both the House of Representatives and the Senate. Then it goes to the president, and the president signs it or does not sign it. Okay. Now, an executive order is an entitlement that the president has to pass something within his, or in the future, her right? The president has certain powers to pass certain things. Now, in the history of our country, presidents have done things that were a little outside of their reach, right? Like a lot of the things that FDR did during World War II and the Great Depression were far beyond the powers that he was entitled to. But it's up to Congress whether they want to check the president or not, right? Stop them from doing that. They didn't stop Lincoln because they're in the middle of the war, and how are you going to argue with freeing the slaves, right? So it changed the federal legal status of more than 3.5 million enslaved African Americans from slave to free. As soon as the slave escaped the control of the federal government, or the Confederate government, by running away or through advances of federal troops, the former slave became free. Technically. Ultimately, the rebel surrender liberated and resulted in the proclamation's application to all of the designated former slaves, right? The last people to know of their emancipation happened in Texas on July 19th, 1865, and that is why, or sorry, June 19th, 1865. I don't know why I mix it up with July, but this is why the Black community celebrates Juneteenth every year, which people just started finding out about, right? Um, Marking the June 19th when the last of the slaves were informed that they were now free. Okay. It did not cover slaves in Union areas that were freed by state action. So those gradual emancipation things did not apply to Emancipation Proclamation. So those people who are still enslaved in the North had to continue to do so unless either the state's action allowed them to do so or until the 13th Amendment was passed in 1865. Okay. Because it was issued under the president's authority to suppress rebellion or his war powers, okay, so the president has certain powers to stop wars or to prevent wars, right? It necessarily excluded areas not in rebellion, okay? So basically, this proclamation is complicated because it's mainly directed towards the Confederacy, right? Freeing all the slaves in the Confederacy, despite the fact that the Confederacy is no longer part of the United States. So it's complicated, right? The northern states kind of, but it's like, again, they're left to do their own thing if they want, but, you know. The proclamation was based on the president's constitutional authority as commander-in-chief of the armed forces. It was not a law passed by Congress. The proclamation was issued after the U.S. government issued a series of warnings in the summer of 1862 under the Second Confiscation Act, allowing Southern Confederate supporters 60 days to surrender or face confiscation of land and slaves. So they basically told the South, like, hey, if you don't surrender, we're going to take your slaves. And the South was like, ha ha ha, bet, right? The proclamation also ordered that suitable young persons, right, who were freed, mostly young, but anybody pretty much fit, could enroll into the paid service of the United States forces and order the Union Army and all segments of the executive branch to recognize and maintain the freedom of the ex-slaves. Okay. So basically, Lincoln mostly did this with the hope that by freeing these slaves that the young men who were able to fight would join the Union Army and their numbers would boost and they could crush the Confederacy, right? So it was all a war plan. So this is what the 13th Amendment said in 1865, because the 13th Amendment was basically the emancipation except freeing everybody and formally, right? So it's just an expansion on that. So the 13th Amendment said, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So, first of all, right, the second part is in every amendment, so I just included it, right? Congress has the power to enforce this, blah, blah, blah. So the first part, right, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude. So basically they're saying no more slaves, no more indentured servants, right? It's not allowed in this country. Second part's super important. That's a sticky part that we still deal with today, right? Except as a punishment for crime. This is where we get something called the convict lease system, right? Basically, convicts are leased out to do extra jobs, like work in governor's mansions in some states, fight California wildfires, stuff like that. And they don't have a say whether they do the jobs, and they're paid barely anything, right? Or making prisoners do work in the prisons but not paying them hardly anything, if not. So this is really complicated, and this clause has really messed up our prison systems ever since. And here is a grandma reading the Emancipation Proclamation. So The proclamation did not compensate the owners. Remember, throughout this class, we've talked about how the owners got paid if their slaves were freed by the government. Well, that no longer happens, right? It did not um, grant citizenship to the ex-slaves, okay, called freedmen. So that's important too, right? Not until the 14th Amendment, which would happen a few years after the war, would black people be considered citizens and get the rights of citizens. So they were basically in like a weird spot, right? They weren't slaves, but they weren't citizens. It made the eradication of slavery an explicit war goal, in addition to the goal of reuniting the Union, as we mentioned. Around 25,000 to 75,000 slaves in regions where the U.S. Army was active were immediately emancipated. It did not apply to those in the 4 slave states that were not in the rebellion, so the border states, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and Missouri, nor to Tennessee, which had been occupied by Union troops, so it didn't apply, and lower Louisiana, which was already under Union occupation as well. So basically, wherever the Union occupied, the emancipation did not necessarily apply. Oh, in addition, the counties that were about to turn, the counties of Virginia that were about to turn into West Virginia, it did not apply there either. So emancipation, of course, would come fully after the passage of the 13th Amendment, which, again, we just talked about, except for a crime, which, has been really bad for our prisons. Emancipation Proclamation outraged white Southerners and their sympathizers who envisioned a race war. It angered some Northern Democrats, energized anti-slavery forces, and undermined elements in Europe that wanted to intervene to help the Confederacy. However, it's never been challenged in court. A couple things, right? The Emancipation Proclamation, of course, made some people nervous because we've talked about in this class before how they felt that if slaves were suddenly freed, they weren't sure if they were going to fit in, they weren't sure if they were going to be equal to white people, stuff like that. So they were like nervous and mad about this, right? They're like, what the hell? Also, the Emancipation Proclamation was very shaky, right? It was just something that Lincoln said. It was kind of a formal thing, but it's not a law. Even the 13th Amendment, right? An amendment to the Constitution is not a law either, right? None of the amendments are. What this means is that it can always be challenged by our government. The government could take a look at it and say, you know what, we don't want the 13th Amendment anymore. They could vote and they could repeal the amendment, which means get rid of it. Or they could make another amendment that says the 13th Amendment is canceled. Now, I don't know in what universe our government's going to do that. I don't know, but all hell would break loose, obviously. But that's always a possibility, right? It's like the 19th Amendment, which gives women the vote. They could take that away, right? Or they could change one of the recent amendments that made the voting age into 18, right? They were talking about making the voting age 16, which my high schoolers were like, absolutely not. But just to show you guys that, like, amendments aren't the laws, right? There's a difference. That's what makes government so complicated, too. Here is a political cartoon. So this black man is supposed to represent slavery as a whole, and here's Abraham Lincoln feeding slavery emancipation. There are, of course, a lot of nasty political cartoons about Lincoln, too, which you can look up yourselves. And here's a depiction of Lincoln sitting in a room trying to write the Emancipation Proclamation. Sort of showing how difficult the process was, right? Because again, he was overextending his powers as the president, but he could do that during a war, right? War is the time where we don't really question what our leaders do too much, and that's led us down some dark roads, honestly. Our final topic for today is Black Union soldiers. I have a lot of stuff to say about this, so it's kind of long, but you know. So, if we're going to talk about this war, of course, it's important to talk about how Black men in particular fought for their freedom, right? Because imagine that you're a slave all your life, you're getting your ass beat by the master, you're in the fields all day picking cotton, tobacco, whatever, and dreaming of freedom. And then you escape and become a contraband, and you got to do some grunt work, and you're still not being paid. And then they say, hey, here's a uniform, here's a gun, do you want to fight the Confederates? Wouldn't you be like, hell yeah, right? So this was their war, really. It was for Black people, right? It was their opportunity to fight for their own freedom and their cause, right? They had more cause than anybody else to join this war. So here's a close-up of some of those faces. This is actually from the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, which we'll talk about in the next slide because they're very important. If you take a look at video D, there's more info on Black soldiers in general. So the issue of raising African American regiments in the Union's war efforts was at first met with trepidation, aka like, I don't know if we want to do this, by officials within the Union command structure, President Abraham Lincoln included. Concerns over the response of the border states, the response of white soldiers and officers, as well as the effectiveness of a colored fighting force was raised. So basically they were concerned, like, can we train these former slaves to be soldiers in time for this war, right? And how are the white soldiers going to handle fighting with Black soldiers? Despite official reluctance from above, the number of white volunteers dropped throughout the war, and Black soldiers were needed whether the population liked it or not. However, African Americans had been volunteering since the first days of war on both sides, though many were turned down. On July 17, 1862, the U.S. Congress passed 2 acts allowing the enlistment of colored troops, but official enrollment occurred only after the final issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. However, state and local militia units had already begun enlisting Blacks, including the Black Brigade of Cincinnati, raised in September 1862 to help provide manpower to thwart a feared Confederate raid on Cincinnati from Kentucky. So basically, some states had already employed Black people to fight and defend their states like they did in the Revolution, right? But they weren't technically fully realized soldiers who were paid and given formal regiments until the Emancipation Proclamation. In May 1863, Congress established the Bureau of Colored Troops in an effort to organize Black efforts in the war. African Americans served as medical officers after 1863, beginning with Baltimore surgeon Alexander Augusta, who is pictured here. Augusta was a senior surgeon with white assistant surgeons under his command at Fort Stanton, Maryland. In actual numbers, African American soldiers eventually comprised 10% of the entire Union Army, which we sort of mentioned before. Losses among African Americans were high. In the last year and a half, and from all reported casualties, approximately 20% of all African Americans enrolled in the military lost their lives during the Civil War, so 2 out of 10 of them ended up dying. Notably, their mortality rate was significantly higher than white soldiers. The most widely known battle fought by African Americans was the assault on Fort Wagner off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina, by the 54th Massachusetts Infantry on July 18, 1863. The 54th volunteered to lead the assault on the strongly fortified Confederate positions of the earthen/sand embankments on the coastal beach. Despite the defeat, the Union was hailed for its valor, which spurred further African American recruitment, giving the Union a numerical military advantage from a large segment of the population the Confederacy did not attempt to exploit until too late in the closing days of the war. Okay, so basically what happened was the 54th was recruited to basically go first in the battle, and all of them were killed, right? They were trying to take over this fort that was near the beach, and there were these huge sand dunes and embankments, and bullets aren't very effective when you have a bunch of sand around you, right? So they were coming up trying to climb these embankments and stuff. The Confederates were in this fort, and they were able to easily shoot them, right? And they were buried in a mass grave as well. And the story of their courage really encouraged other Black people, particularly the slaves who were still in the South, to run away and join the Union Army, right, to be like them. And unfortunately for the South, they didn't realize until too late that they needed to recruit Black soldiers in order to increase their ranks. So they missed the opportunity to recruit these Black slaves before it was too late. And if you take a picture, if you take a look at video E, there is a trailer for the movie Glory. Glory was actually the first major movie that Denzel Washington was in, right? Denzel Washington's in it. Morgan Freeman, the guy from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. What's his name? Matthew Broderick. Yeah, he's in it. He plays the white officer that commands the Black unit. But that movie is about the 54th Massachusetts, and it's very good. It's also a good opportunity to see how poorly Black soldiers were treated and how they were given secondhand uniforms. Sometimes they weren't even given shoes, so. And here is a painting or picture of the 54th Massachusetts in action. Okay. Here's some more uniforms. Black prisoners were not treated the same as white prisoners. So if you got imprisoned by the Confederacy, you weren't really treated very well. They received no medical attention, harsh punishments, and would not be used in a prisoner exchange because the Confederate states only saw them as escaped slaves fighting against their masters. So they weren't treated like white soldiers, and thus they had to rot in the jails, basically. According to the Militia Act of 1862, soldiers of African descent were to receive $10 per month with an additional deduction for clothing at $3 a month. So basically, you only made $7 a month because you had to pay for your uniform. In contrast, white privates, right, white soldiers, received $12 per month plus a clothing allowance of $3.50. So they technically got $15.50 a month so that they could pay for their uniforms, which sucks, right? Many regiments struggled for equal pay, some refusing any money in pay until June 15, 1864, when the Federal Congress granted equal pay for all soldiers. Besides discrimination in pay, colored units were often disproportionately still assigned labor work rather than the possibility of actual frontline combat assignments. Blacks, both slave and free, were also heavily involved in assisting the Union in matters of intelligence, and their contributions were labeled Black dispatches. So basically, there were a lot of Black people as well who got to do spy missions, right? Sneaking, coded messages to the Union, cracking, sort of codes that were used by Confederates, things like that. A lot of women were given these jobs as well during the war. Like the Army, the Union Navy's official position at the beginning of the war was ambivalence towards the use of either Northern free blacks or runaway slaves. The constant stream, however, of escaped slaves seeking refuge aboard Union ships forced the Navy to formulate a policy towards them. In time, the Union Navy would see almost 16% of its ranks supplied by African Americans, performing in a wide range of enlisted roles. In contrast to the Army, the Navy not only paid equal wages between white and black sailors, but offered considerably more for entry-level enlisted positions. Food, rations, and medical care were also improved over the Army, with the Navy benefiting from a regular stream of supplies from Union-held ports. So basically, it was way better to join the Navy. You got equal pay to the white people. There are more of you that were recruited, and you got better supplies. And you were less likely to see battle than the Army, right? You may have a better option for, or a better chance of surviving. Okay, here's another soldier. This is the last slide, I promise. There's a lot to say. Becoming a commissioned officer, however, was still out of reach for nearly all black sailors. With rare exceptions, only the rank of petty officer would be offered to black sailors, and in practice only to free blacks, who often were the only ones with naval careers sufficiently long enough to earn the rank. So basically, petty officers not that much of a step up from a regular recruit, right? Black soldiers, despite the fact that they would not earn these higher ranks like lieutenant, general, captain, things like that, until after World War II, right? That's like almost 100 years later. They still fought in these wars because they felt that it was the right thing to do. It would make black people look better if they fought well, right? And they would get the discipline and training they needed. Prisoner exchanges between the Union and Confederacy were suspended when the Confederacy refused to return black soldiers captured in uniform. In October 1862, the Confederate Congress issued a resolution declaring all Negroes, free and slave, that they should be delivered to their respective states to be dealt with according to the present and future laws of such state or states. So they wanted the states to do what they wanted with the captured soldiers, right? Basically, that's sort of condemning them to slavery, whether they were free or black. Black troops were actually less likely to be taken prisoner because they didn't want to have to feed black troops if they didn't need to. And Confederate troops preferred to murder black troops on the battlefield. In the last few months of the war, the Confederate government agreed to exchange all prisoners, white and black, and several thousand troops were exchanged until the surrender of the Confederacy ended all hostilities. Okay. So that's pretty much what you could expect if you're a black soldier, right? Now, I don't talk about the black women that maybe disguise themselves as soldiers because we don't have a lot of data on that, but maybe some did, right? Again, there were spies, code breakers. Like in the Revolution and future wars, there were also a lot of black men who didn't see combat, right? They were basically there to cook, clean, dig latrines, assemble and disassemble camps, basically act as servants during the war. So not everybody got to see battle. So the last video for today, video F, is another reenactment of a battle, right? This one is pretty tough because the Confederates had the high ground, so you're sort of knowing that you're walking into a high risk, high mortality situation, which often they had to do. Here is a drawing of some potential troops arriving at one of these camps. As you can see, they're in their regular clothing, getting ready for training, which you can see a depiction of that in the beginning of Glory. And here they are lined up ready for battle after training. So that is the end of today's lecture. So we're going to finish PowerPoint 11 next time by discussing an important black man during this time. And then we're going to begin the Reconstruction period, right? Our last PowerPoint. We're going to talk about various things, right? Like the president who took over when Lincoln was assassinated, right? Reparations, also the government body that was responsible for making sure that these slaves achieved freedom and that they could become citizens. Okay, so yeah,